331. That was the wound count on Jayna Murray's body, an overkill so savage it defied logic. Inside the blood-slicked Bethesda Lululemon, the air heavy with the scent of iron, a miracle was discovered. Brittany Norwood lay bound nearby, weeping, the sole survivor of a midnight massacre by two masked phantoms. It was a harrowing tale of survival, until the evidence revealed that the monsters hadn't broken in. They were already on the clock. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Bethesda, Maryland is more than just a suburb. It is an enclave of relentless ambition. Located just northwest of the nation's capital, it serves as a manicured sanctuary for Washington's elite, lawyers, lobbyists, and high-level consultants who demand perfection in every facet of their lives. At the heart of this meticulously groomed community lies Bethesda Row, a sprawling outdoor shopping district where the brick-paved streets are lined with high-end boutiques and gourmet eateries. It is a place where the air itself feels expensive, and the concept of violent crime feels like a distant, gritty fiction from another world. In 2011, there was perhaps no brand that encapsulated the Bethesda lifestyle more perfectly than Lululemon Athletica. Lululemon was far more than a retail store. It was a secular temple for the health-conscious. The brand sold a specific brand of enlightenment wrapped in high-performance fabric. Every store featured the manifesto on its shopping bags, a collection of affirmations about living in the moment, breathing deeply, and pursuing greatness. The employees weren't just sales clerks. They were educators, tasked with building community and inspiring customers to reach their peak physical and mental potential. To work at the Bethesda Row location was to be at the epicenter of this cult of wellness. It was a fast-paced environment that demanded both physical stamina and a sunny, unflappable disposition that mirrored the brand's aspirational image. Among the rising stars at the Bethesda store was 30-year-old Jayna Murray. To those who knew her, Jayna was the human embodiment of the Lululemon manifesto. She was a woman who didn't just walk through life. She lunged through it with purpose and an infectious, wide-toothed grin. Born in Kansas and raised in Texas, Jayna possessed a blend of Midwestern warmth and a sophisticated global curiosity. She was a polymath of energy, an athlete who competed in Ironman triathlons, a traveler who had explored the cobblestone streets of Europe and the rugged landscapes of South America, and a scholar with a ferocious appetite for knowledge. At the time, Jayna was balancing her responsibilities at Lululemon with a grueling academic schedule. She was enrolled in a dual-degree program at Johns Hopkins University, pursuing both a Master of Business Administration and a Master of Arts in Communication. She wasn't just looking for a career, she was building an empire of her own making. Her colleagues and friends described her as the glue, the person who organized the group dinners, the one who remembered birthdays, and the woman who could turn a standard retail shift into a masterclass in team building. She was bright, blonde, and possessed a level of competence that was both inspiring and, to some, perhaps a bit intimidating. Her life was a mosaic of high-achieving fragments. She was a devoted daughter, a supportive sister, and a friend who seemed to have cracked the code of the 24-hour day. In the rare moments she wasn't studying or working, she was outside, her athletic frame moving through the world with a grace that suggested she was perfectly in sync with her surroundings. She was the quintessential Bethesda success story in the making, a woman on the verge of a brilliant future. But as Jayna Murray was scaling the heights of her personal and professional life, another woman was entering the same orbit from a much more fractured trajectory. Brittany Norwood, 28, also shared the athletic pedigree that Lululemon coveted. She was a former college soccer standout at Stony Brook University, known for her speed on the field and her ability to navigate complex social circles. To her family and many of her peers, Brittany was a success story in her own right. One of 7 children from a hardworking family, she had used her athletic prowess to secure an education and a foothold in the competitive world of high-end fitness retail. On the surface, Brittany and Jayna were two sides of the same coin. Both were young, fit, and ambitious women working in a prestigious environment. But beneath Brittany's carefully maintained educator persona lay a history of professional instability and troubling behavior that had followed her from job to job. There were whispers of petty thefts at previous workplaces, of small sums of money disappearing from lockers, and of a strange chameleon-like ability to tell different stories to different people. While Jayna Murray's life was built on a foundation of transparency and relentless effort, Brittany's was increasingly becoming a house of cards, held together by small lies and a desperate need to maintain the appearance of the golden girl athlete she had once been. By early 2011, these two women, one soaring, the other quietly unraveling, were placed on a collision course within the narrow, mirror-lined aisles of the Bethesda Row store. The corporate culture that preached honesty and integrity was about to become the backdrop for a confrontation that would strip away the veneer of the Bethesda elite and reveal a darkness that no amount of positive thinking or yoga could ever hope to dispel. The professional convergence of Jayna Murray and Brittany Norwood within the glass-fronted confines of the Bethesda Row Lululemon was, at first glance, a seamless match of brand and personnel. In the high-stakes environment of premium retail, where the educator role demanded a blend of athletic credibility and approachable charm, both women appeared to be ideal representatives. They were both physically fit, seemingly disciplined, and possessed the outward confidence of women who had spent their lives competing at high levels. For several months in late 2010 and early 2011, they moved through the store's minimalist aisles, folding stacks of Luan fabric, assisting the yoga-obsessed elite of Maryland, and projecting an image of synchronized wellness. Yet the foundations upon which their lives were built could not have been more disparate. To understand the friction that would eventually ignite into a fatal explosion, one must look at the athletic legacy Brittany Norwood brought to Bethesda. Years before she arrived in Maryland, Brittany was a force to be reckoned with on the soccer fields of Stony Brook University in New York. As a standout defender, she was described by coaches as a linchpin of the team's backline, a player whose speed and aggressive tactics earned her all-conference and all-region accolades. To the public and the local sports media, she was a success story, a woman whose grit on the field suggested a future of leadership and distinction. However, behind the scenes at Stony Brook, a far more troubling narrative was taking shape. While Brittany was a star in the jersey, her teammates and roommates whispered about a persistent, shadow-like habit that followed her into the locker rooms and shared dormitories. Multiple peers from her university days later recounted a pattern of behavior that pointed toward kleptomania, small, inexplicable thefts of cash, clothing, and personal items. One teammate was so disturbed by the constant disappearances of her belongings that she eventually quit the team altogether, unable to reconcile the golden girl image Brittany projected with the reality of her light-fingered habits. There were even deeper cracks in the facade. Allegations of stalking an ex-boyfriend surfaced from 2007, leading to a restraining order. Despite these warning signs, Brittany had no formal criminal record when she applied to Lululemon, allowing her to successfully navigate the hiring process and slip into the educator role with her secrets intact. Jayna Murray, by contrast, lived a life of radical transparency. As she balanced her store shifts with her dual master's degrees at Johns Hopkins, her ambition was fueled by a genuine desire for achievement rather than the maintenance of an illusion. While Brittany's energy often felt performative, a mask designed to hide a growing list of professional failures and social debts, Jayna's was grounded in a relentless, triathlete-level work ethic. As the two worked side by side, the subtle differences in their temperaments began to grate. Jayna was the person who followed every rule to the letter, while Brittany was increasingly viewed by some staff members as someone who cut corners, a woman whose sweet and funny exterior was starting to wear thin under the pressure of Bethesda's high expectations. The tension reached a critical mass on the afternoon of Friday, March 11th, 2011. It was a standard closing shift, the kind of mundane routine that usually ended with a quick exchange of pleasantries and the locking of the front doors. However, Lululemon maintained a strict security protocol known as the bag check. Before leaving the premises, employees were required to inspect one another's bags to ensure that no unpaid merchandise was being taken home. It was a routine intended to foster a culture of honesty, but on this particular evening, it became a trap. As Jayna Murray performed the check on Brittany's bag, she discovered something that shattered the professional courtesy between them: a pair of Lululemon yoga pants that had not been purchased. To Jayna, this wasn't just a minor infraction. It was a betrayal of the community-based values the brand preached. She didn't confront Brittany with a scene. Instead, she followed the chain of command. After they left the store and parted ways, Jayna contacted their manager, Rachel Ertley, to report what she had found. The manager, perhaps exhausted by the long week, told Jayna that the matter would be handled in the morning. For Brittany Norwood, that phone call represented the end of her carefully curated world. In the status-conscious ecosystem of Bethesda, being branded a thief was more than just a reason for termination. It was a social death sentence. Her identity as a Golden Girl athlete, her standing in her large family, and her future career prospects were all tied to the image of the high-achieving professional she pretended to be. If Jayna Murray was allowed to speak the truth in the morning, the house of cards would collapse. Driven by a cold, desperate pragmatism, Brittany reached for her phone only minutes after the manager had been alerted. She called Jayna Murray, her voice likely trembling with a fabricated urgency. She told Jayna that she had forgotten her wallet, or perhaps her keys, inside the darkened store and begged for her help to get back inside. Jayna, ever the helper, ever the woman who made people feel needed, agreed to return. She drove her car back to Bethesda Row, unsuspecting of the shift in the atmosphere. When she pulled up to the curb and saw Brittany waiting in the shadows near the entrance, she believed she was performing a final act of kindness for a coworker in distress. As the alarm was deactivated at 10:05 p.m. and the heavy glass door swung shut behind them, the two women entered a space that was no longer a boutique, but a closed-loop arena. Jayna Murray walked into the back of the store, moving toward the employee area to help her friend find a missing item, entirely unaware that the woman behind her had spent the last 20 minutes transitioning from a desperate employee into something far more predatory. The silence of the high-end mall began to settle around them, a silence that would soon be shattered by the first of 331 strikes. The heavy glass door of the Lululemon boutique clicked shut at 10:05 p.m., sealing the two women inside a silent, high-end tomb. The store was bathed in the dim, artificial glow of security lights, casting long, geometric shadows across the racks of yoga gear. Jayna moved toward the back of the store, her mind likely occupied by the administrative headache of the morning's impending report. She had no reason to look over her shoulder. She had no reason to suspect that the woman she had just befriended, the woman she was helping out of a jam, was currently scanning the room for a heavy object. The attack did not begin with a shout. It began with a choice. Brittany reached for the nearest heavy-duty tool, a hammer used for store maintenance, and struck the first blow. It was a strike delivered with the explosive power of a collegiate athlete, catching Jayna completely off guard. The shift in reality was instantaneous. The sanctuary of the wellness brand was replaced by a visceral, primitive struggle for survival. As the struggle moved from the front of the store into the back hallway and the narrow employee bathroom, the violence escalated into something beyond a mere murder. It became a frantic, multi-weapon assault. Brittany did not bring a gun or a knife to the scene. Instead, she treated the retail space like a grotesque arsenal. Investigators would later determine that at least 5 different weapons were used: a hammer, a heavy wrench, a box cutter, and even a peg from a display rack. The auditory experience of that night was hauntingly recorded by the only witnesses who didn't know they were listening to a crime. Next door, at the Apple store, 2 employees were still on the clock, performing inventory in the quiet of the late night. Through the shared wall, they heard the sounds of a nightmare. They later told investigators they heard thuds, the sound of bodies hitting the floor, and a woman's voice screaming in terror. One of the employees recalled hearing a voice, likely Jayna's, pleading for her life, asking her attacker to talk to her, begging for a reason why this was happening. There was a chilling silence, followed by more thuds. For reasons that remain a point of bitter debate in the community, the Apple Store employees didn't call the police. They assumed it was just a loud argument, perhaps a domestic dispute that was none of their business. They went back to their work, while less than 12 inches of drywall away, Jayna Murray was being methodically dismantled. The sheer volume of the overkill is what eventually broke the case wide open. Jayna did not die quickly. The medical examiner's report was a map of unimaginable agony. Out of the 331 distinct wounds, the majority were concentrated on her head and upper body. There were deep lacerations from the box cutter, blunt force trauma from the hammer that fractured her skull, and defensive wounds on her hands and forearms that showed she had fought back with everything she had. Her fingers were sliced to the bone as she tried to grab the blades. Despite the onslaught, Jayna managed to stay alive for a significant portion of the attack. Forensic evidence suggested she was still breathing when her spinal cord was finally severed, a terminal strike intended to ensure she would never speak again. As the life drained from Jayna on the floor of the back hallway, Brittany Norwood did not flee. She did not panic. Instead, she entered a state of cold, clinical calculation that lasted for nearly 8 hours. The transition from a killer to a victim was a masterpiece of staging. Brittany knew that her presence at the store would be impossible to explain unless she was also a target of the masked men she intended to invent. She began by addressing her own appearance. Using the same box cutter that had ended Jayna's life, Brittany carefully sliced through her own Lululemon attire. She inflicted shallow, superficial scratches on her own arms and chest, wounds that were painful enough to look convincing, but nowhere near the lethal depth of the injuries she had inflicted on Jayna. She even went as far as to create a small mark on her forehead. The most sophisticated part of the deception involved the floor. Brittany found a pair of men's size 14 sneakers in the back of the store, merchandise used for display or as samples. She put them on and began walking through Jayna's blood. She paced through the store, creating a trail of large, masculine footprints that seemed to suggest 2 intruders had been stalking the premises. She made sure the prints led toward the back and around the body, but she made a critical error that would eventually haunt her. The intruder only seemed to walk in certain directions, and the prints never quite made it to the exits in a logical way. After the men were created, Brittany proceeded to bind herself. She used zip ties and scraps of fabric to tie her own wrists and ankles, positioning herself in the back of the store near Jayna's cooling remains. She tucked herself into a corner, surrounded by the carnage she had authored, and waited. The psychological endurance required to sit in that darkness is almost impossible to fathom. For hours, Brittany sat in the silence of the boutique, feet away from her mangled coworker, rehearsing the story she would tell. She waited for the morning sun to hit the brick of Bethesda Row. She waited for the sounds of the morning commute, for the click of the manager's key in the front door. She sat there, a predator in a victim's skin, preparing to deliver the performance of her life to the first person who walked through the door. By the time the store manager arrived at 8 a.m., Brittany was ready. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a woman who had endured the unthinkable, or so she hoped the world would believe. The sun rose over Bethesda Row on Saturday, March 12, 2011, with a clinical brightness that usually signaled a lucrative weekend for the local merchant class. For Rachel Ertley, the store manager, the morning began with the rhythmic, caffeinated checklist of a retail lead, coffee in hand. the crisp spring air, and the anticipation of a busy Saturday morning shift. But as she approached the glass-fronted sanctuary of the Lululemon boutique at approximately 8 a.m., the familiar rhythm fractured. The heavy glass doors, which should have been bolted shut until the official opening, were slightly ajar. There was no sign of a forced entry, no shattered glass on the pavement, just an unnerving, heavy silence that seemed to push back against the morning light. Inside, the minimalist, high-energy aesthetic of the store had been transformed into a landscape of chaotic disarray. Piles of high-end athletic wear were strewn across the floor, but it wasn't the harmless mess of a busy sale. It was the wreckage of a desperate struggle. Ortley hesitated at the threshold, the stillness of the mannequins feeling like a silent warning. As she moved deeper into the store, the scent hit her first. The thick, iron-rich tang of stagnant blood that hung heavy in the air, clashing with the faint, lingering scent of expensive candles. In the back of the store, near the employee hallway, the manager stumbled upon the center of the nightmare. Jayna Murray lay in a pool of dark crimson, her body so catastrophically damaged that she was nearly unrecognizable as the vibrant woman who had closed the store the night before. And then, a sound. A faint, rhythmic thumping from the darkness of the employee bathroom. In the cramped confines of the restroom, Ortley discovered Brittany Norwood. She was huddled on the floor, her wrists and ankles bound with zip ties, her clothing torn and bloodied, her face a mask of dried tears and shock. To Ortley and to the first responders who flooded the scene minutes later, the narrative was self-evident. This was a robbery gone horribly wrong, a brutal, senseless act of violence against two defenseless women. As paramedics lifted Brittany onto a stretcher, her voice was a fragile whisper. She told them they were still in the store. She asked if the men were gone. This initial, panicked question cemented her status as a victim in the eyes of everyone wearing a uniform. The survivor's tale that Brittany delivered over the next several hours was a masterpiece of fabricated trauma. In her hospital bed, surrounded by the beeping monitors and the hushed tones of detectives, she described a night of sustained terror. She told investigators that after she and Jayna had re-entered the store to retrieve her forgotten wallet, two men in dark clothing and masks had slipped in behind them. She provided a vivid description of the phantoms. One man was tall, perhaps 6 feet, while the other was shorter. Both possessed a cold, predatory energy. She claimed the men had beaten them with whatever tools they could find, subjected her to a sexual assault, and forced Jayna into the back hallway where the most brutal sounds originated. Brittany's performance was meticulously calibrated. She spoke of the hours she spent bound in the darkness, listening to Jayna's muffled pleas. She recounted how she had prayed for the morning to come, certain that she would be the next one to die. She even added a layer of psychological depth, telling the detectives that the men had told her they were doing this because they liked to hear them scream. It was a story designed to evoke maximum empathy while simultaneously pointing the police toward a non-existent external threat. The social echo of this discovery was instantaneous and paralyzing. Bethesda, a community that prided itself on its bubble of safety, was suddenly gripped by a visceral collective panic. Rumors of the masked killers spread through the affluent neighborhoods like a contagion. Yoga studios canceled their Saturday morning classes. Parents refused to let their teenagers walk to the nearby cinema, and the local police department shifted into a high-intensity, all-hands-on-deck manhunt. The local news cycles were dominated by Brittany's heroism, the woman who had survived the unthinkable and was now the only living link to the predators. The community looked at her as a symbol of resilience, a golden girl who had looked into the face of evil and lived. For the lead investigators, including Detective Dimitri Rubin, Brittany was initially treated as a sacred witness. They were gentle with their questioning, mindful of her post-traumatic state. She gave them a timeline that seemed to fit. She spoke of a dark van the men might have used, and she even described the way the taller man moved with a slight limp. It was a performance that nearly held up under the initial scrutiny of a grieving town. But as the forensic teams began the grueling process of reading the store, the physics of the crime scene began to scream louder than Brittany's whispers. The survivor was talking, but the blood spatter was starting to tell a different story. The detectives noticed that while Jayna had been subjected to 331 strikes, Brittany's injuries were curiously shallow. Neat, parallel scratches that looked more like a map than a struggle. They looked at the zip ties on her wrists and noticed a level of slack that suggested she could have slipped her hands out at any moment. The monsters Brittany had described were starting to look more like shadows cast by her own hand. The Bethesda bubble hadn't been breached from the outside. The darkness had been invited in, and it was currently sitting in a hospital bed, being hailed as a hero. The investigation into the horrors at Bethesda Row began with a city on edge and a police force operating under the heavy mantle of empathy for a survivor. For the first 48 hours, the Montgomery County Police Department treated the Lululemon boutique as a crime scene breached by external predators. They scoured the alleyways for discarded masks. They pulled grainy footage from every traffic camera within a 5-mile radius. And they looked for a dark van that Brittany Norwood had described with such haunting specificity. But as the forensic specialists moved from the broad strokes of the survivor's tale to the microscopic reality of the evidence, the narrative of the two masked intruders began to dissolve like a ghost in the morning light. The first major fracture in the facade appeared under the harsh glow of the forensics lab. Detectives were haunted by the size 14 shoe prints that Brittany had used to illustrate the presence of a large, aggressive male. While the prints were clearly visible in the blood-slicked hallways, their physics made no sense. A man standing 6 feet tall with a size 14 foot has a natural stride length, a distance between steps that reflects his height and weight. However, the prints in the store suggested an intruder with a remarkably short, choppy gait, one that perfectly matched the stride of a 5'5" woman. Furthermore, the trail of blood was suspiciously one way. In a genuine struggle involving two large men, footprints would be chaotic, overlapping, and tracking blood toward the exits. These prints were clinical, almost as if someone had carefully placed them to tell a story rather than leaving them in a panic. When investigators searched the back of the store, they found the smoking gun tucked away in a storage bin, a pair of men's display sneakers, soaked in Jayna Murray's blood on the soles, but dry on the inside. Then there was the matter of the forgotten wallet. Brittany had claimed that she and Jayna returned to the store at 10:05 p.m. because she had left her wallet inside. However, when police searched Brittany's car, which was parked blocks away, they found her wallet sitting in plain sight on the passenger seat. This discrepancy turned a mistake into a calculated lie. Why would someone beg a coworker to reopen a store for a wallet they already had in their possession? The answer pointed toward a lure, a trap designed to get Jayna into a controlled, private environment. The thermal and auditory evidence from the neighboring Apple store provided the final, chilling nail in the coffin. Detectives returned to the two employees who had heard the sounds of the struggle through the wall. Under more intense questioning, the employees clarified a detail that Brittany hadn't accounted for. They didn't hear a chorus of voices. They didn't hear the deep, commanding shouts of two men. They heard one voice, high-pitched and desperate, pleading for mercy, and another voice that remained terrifyingly silent. The sounds of the thuds didn't suggest a group assault. They suggested a rhythmic, singular obsession. As the forensic report on Brittany's own injuries came back, the survivor status was officially revoked. The medical examiner noted that the scratches on Brittany's arms were perfectly parallel, spaced in a way that suggested they were made by someone holding a tool with a steady hand, rather than a victim thrashing in a dark hallway. The sexual assault she described left no physical markers, no DNA from an unknown male, and no evidence of the struggle she claimed had occurred in the bathroom. The only DNA found under Jayna's fingernails evidence of her final, heroic fight for life, belonged to Brittany Norwood. The pivot in the investigation culminated in a high-stakes, multi-hour interrogation that mirrored the psychological intensity of a stage play. Detectives moved from being Brittany's protectors to her prosecutors. They presented her with the footprints, they showed her the photos of her own car, and they asked her to explain why her blood-stained clothes were found hidden in a bag that only she had access to. Brittany's demeanor shifted from traumatized victim to a woman of stony, unyielding silence. She didn't break. She didn't weep. She simply stared into the middle distance, her golden girl mask finally slipping to reveal the cold, predatory pragmatism underneath. On March 18, 2011, just 1 week after the community had rallied around her as a hero, Brittany Norwood was arrested. The charge wasn't just murder, it was first-degree murder. The detectives had realized that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a meticulously staged execution, carried out by a woman who valued her retail reputation more than a human life. The masked men of Bethesda Row were officially declared a fiction, and the survivor was revealed to be the very monster the town had been terrified of. The trial of Brittany Norwood transformed the Montgomery County Circuit Court into a theater of the macabre, where the polished image of a survivor was systematically dismantled. Prosecutors presented the jury with a visceral reconstruction of the 331 wounds, arguing that such an exhaustive level of violence was not a crime of passion, but a determined effort to silence a witness. The defense attempted to argue for a lesser charge of second-degree murder, suggesting a mental breakdown, but the evidence of the cold-blooded staging was insurmountable. The size 14 footprints and the forgotten wallet were not the actions of a woman in a frenzy. They were the actions of a master manipulator. On November 2nd, 2011, the jury required less than 2 hours to reach their decision, guilty of first-degree murder. At her sentencing, the judge spared no words, describing the crime as one of the most calculating and cold-blooded acts in the history of the county. Brittany Norwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, the glass storefront at Bethesda Row remains a place of commerce. But the community has never truly forgotten the silence of that Saturday morning. Jayna Murray's family established a foundation in her name, funding scholarships and promoting the adventurous, brilliant life she was meant to lead. Brittany Norwood remains in the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women, the Golden Girl athlete, whose ultimate legacy is a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a practiced smile. In a town built on ambition, the Lululemon murder remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't a stranger in the alley. It's the person holding the door open for you, smiling, waiting for the lights to go out. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.